I just want to thank you guys for being here today. This is the third of 4 events that are part of Ethics Week, our 19th annual one. And we have the pleasure of having Susan Ochs with us today, who bravely flew in from LaGuardia Airport by way of Detroit today. And I think the worst weather was when she arrived here, but maybe the cab ride to the hotel might have been the worst part. But anyway, she's a trooper for coming all the way out for this. I really appreciate it. My name's Adam Cron, for those of you who don't know me. I run the Notre Dame Deloitte Center for Ethical Leadership upstairs, and I met Susan at an event in last May in Manhattan, where we were getting together with some of the leaders of the financial services industry to talk about some of the things that Susan's going to cover today. And when we were putting this year's Ethics Week together, I thought if she'd be willing to come out here, it would be really interesting for you to hear. So we're fortunate that she was willing to come out here. All right, so just a very brief background. Susan is a senior fellow at the New America Foundation and the founder of its Better Banking Project. Her research is focused on mindsets and culture in banking and the implications for risk management, reform, and innovation efforts. She advises senior banking executives on culture, strategy, and business planning. She has worked at a large investment management firm, a private equity firm. She has her MBA from Harvard Business School and a bachelor's degree in economics from Duke. And it's my pleasure to introduce Susan. Oh, and the last thing I'll say is, she'd really like to know stuff that you guys are thinking about and want to know about. So when we get to the point where it's Q&A and there's the awkward silence because you don't want to speak up, just anticipate that now. And while she's giving her presentation, then when it gets to the Q&A part, we don't have to burn any time. You can just dive right in with questions, okay? All right, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks, Adam, and thanks to all of you for braving the snow and coming out here. I guess the snow is less of a big deal for you than it is for me. But as Adam was saying, I spend so much of my time in kind of corporate boardrooms and dealing with executives and sort of the old white men. So it's a treat for me to be among the youth of America here tonight. So thanks for coming out. As Adam sort of said, my background is really kind of focused around financial services. I started out in the industry. I was working at JP Morgan, just a young analyst. Life took me in other directions. I then moved down to Washington, D.C. I worked on a presidential campaign. Then I was at the Treasury Department in the SEC, went back to Wall Street, went back to being a regulator again. I was working on actually the bailout at the beginning of the Obama administration, the bank bailout, TARP, everybody's favorite program. And when I left Treasury this time in 2010, I really, I had a potentially sneaking suspicion that I might be part of the problem. But I thought, I've worked in this industry, I've regulated this industry, I've helped to bail out this industry, and I think it's time to get to a better place. And what does that better place look like, and how do we get there? And a lot of people would say, well, it's too complicated, there are all these issues, blah, 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 you can't change culture, you can't change people, bankers will be bankers. And I really thought, you know what, we can do better than this. We might not be able to make it perfect, but we can do better than this. And so that was the premise that I started the Better Banking Project. So it's not the best banking project, it's the Better Banking Project. We can do better. And I've really been studying culture for the past 5 years, specifically in financial services. And the examples I'll give you today are related to the financial industry. Not a lot of jargon, I promise, don't worry. But they're really applicable across corporate America. These are not issues that you find that are unique to financial services. The magnitude might be unique to financial services, but in general, the dynamics are not unique. I think you'll find that they're more broadly applicable. So I don't actually, and I was just saying this to Adam before, I don't actually use the term ethics when I talk to people. Because the problem is that everybody thinks that they're ethical. It's kind of like having a sense of humor. Everybody thinks they're funny, including me. Pity laugh, that's good, thank you. So the problem with ethics is if you start to use that word, people automatically kind of tune you out a little bit because they think, well, I'm an ethical person, so I don't need to hear whatever you're telling me. And unfortunately, what the behavioral economists have shown us is that most people will actually cheat just a little bit. Just a little bit, and only up to the point where they can still consider themselves an ethical person. And there's a now famous experiment. Dan Ariely, who's one of sort of the pioneers of behavioral economics, conducted this experiment where he had people take a math test. and you self-graded your math test at the end of the quiz, and then you shredded it, and you self-reported the answer. So you said, with this, I got 6 right, I got 8 right, whatever. It was 10 questions. And the shredding machine was actually fake. So you thought you were shredding it, except you weren't shredding it, and the people that were running the experiment knew exactly how many questions you'd actually gotten right versus how many you reported you got right. And they conducted this experiment hundreds of times now. And the fascinating thing is that in a control group, the average person will get 4 questions right, and the average person will report that they got 6 questions right. So they're not saying they got 10 questions right. They're not cheating wildly, but they're just cheating a little bit. And that's generally the dynamic that you find broadly throughout the world. And that's about the 80%, that middle group. There are 10% of the people that will kind of just cheat no matter what. They're sort of the bad apples. And then there are 10% of the people that are just Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts and will never cheat. But most of us are in that big 80% lump in the middle. And that's why this kind of starts to get so sticky. And the equivalent that you wind up with in the corporate world, you get people start talking about things like fudging their expense reports, or shading the truth when you're talking to a customer. And you'll note that there's even that special language, right? Nobody says I'm cheating and I'm lying, right? I'm just fudging the numbers. It's just a little fudge. It's not a big deal. Or I'm just shading the truth a little bit. I'm not lying. It's not a lie, because that I know would be wrong, right? That triggers something that you know is wrong. But so that's why, again, they can justify whatever they're doing, these small little discrepancies, and still maintain their own sense of ethics. And so you can see when banks are thinking about, or anybody is thinking about, well, how do we get people to behave better? They focus so much on issues like compliance. And what are the legal requirements? And how do we make sure that people have done their ethics training and checked the box in the ethics training? And the problem is that this isn't actually a compliance issue. It's a mindset issue. And so that's why I'm here talking about mindsets today, because the mindset is such an important piece of behavior, and it really gets overlooked often, in fact, most of the time. And there's a construct we sort of call mental models, which is basically a mindset. And it's basically the way that you think about your approach to a situation. So it's your assumptions, it's the kind of operating principles that you have as you approach a situation, it's the values that you hold, the biases that you may bring to a certain situation. One of the mental models I have is that when it's snowing, you're probably going to get stuck in Detroit and not actually make it to your event. So my mental model happened to be wrong today, happily. I have gotten stuck in Detroit before, which is where I think I have this bad mental model. But a lot of people have mental models about all kinds of things. Adam and I were talking earlier just today about a lot of people, when you talk about ethics, they have a mental model that you can't have values in business and you can't be ethical in business and still be profitable or be as profitable as you want, right? People have this idea that these two issues are in conflict. And so that if you're going to choose values, you are therefore not choosing profitability. I maintain that that is a false construct, but a lot of people, it is very pervasive throughout the business world, a lot of people believe that that's the case. And part of the problem with this idea of mental models is that it's the idea of culture in general, but in particular mindsets, it's viewed as very squishy. And people don't like squishy. They like analytics, they like hard numbers, they like data. And that's part of why I actually started doing research around this, so I could put some hard data in front of corporate executives to say, look, this is actually what you're dealing with. I know you think it might be X or Y, but this is what you're dealing with. And this is actually how it's impacting you. So just to give you a quick background on sort of what a mental model is or where it came from. So our brains, with synapses are firing, we're processing millions of bits of information every day. And this used to have an evolutionary purpose, or it still does, right? There was a rustling in the bushes, and you had, through your experience and other assumptions, you knew that the rustling in the bushes was a lion coming to get you, and you didn't have to sit there and run through a thought process. You just started to run and take off, right? There's a survival part of mental models, which is very important. And you still, every day, right? You see a car coming, you get out of the street, right? All those things are important and useful. What happens to us in other situations, however, is that it starts to narrow our thinking. And so you have a mental model, and you've used it before, you've seen this experience before, you have certain assumptions or biases, and you start to use what I call the absolute words. So always, he always does this, marketing never comes through for us on that, everybody knows such and such is true, nobody's ever going to believe blah, 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 right? Those are mental models that you have, right? Those are good key indicators. They don't always have to have those absolute words, but when you hear yourself, oh, I always get stuck in Detroit, right? Well, you don't always get stuck. It's just sometimes it happens and it sticks with you. So it's a compilation of the past experiences you've had, the behaviors you've observed, certain explicit or implicit messages that you've gotten. And then we all also go out into the world with what psychologists call confirmation bias. So we are out in the world looking for information that supports what we already think. We're trying to we have a theory, we're not out in the world trying to disprove our theory like good scientists, we're looking for data that supports our theory, and we actually wind up ignoring the stuff that doesn't support our theory. So just to give you a silly example, but one that is true. So I am a fellow at a think tank, and think tanks have lots of big fancy donors, and they have these swanky events, and you go and you're supposed to go and schmooze with the trustees and tell them about all the great work you're doing, and sort of sing for your supper a little bit. So I was going to one of these events a couple years ago. It was a big swanky black tie event at the Plaza in New York City, all these big swanky trustees. I was running late, I had just come off another trip. The dress I was supposed to wear, I didn't realize had a rip in it, so I couldn't wear it. So the only other thing in my closet that seemed like it would even remotely work was this kind of green sort of metallic dress. It was kind of ugly. In fact, it was very ugly. Anyway, I was thinking, I'm going to stand out like a sore thumb in this thing. Should I just not go? This is like a horrible thing. I know all the guys in the room are like, why are you telling us this story? But I'll get to a point. So I get to this event, and I'm sort of feeling like a kind of large metallic frog in this dress. And I get to the event, and all of a sudden, I spot somebody else who's wearing a green dress. And I'm thinking like, wow, okay, I don't feel so bad. And then I spot another person wearing a green dress, and I'm thinking like, I am so on trend and I didn't even know it. Oh my God, like green is the color of the season, clearly, right? Everybody's in green. Now, of course, cut to when I see the photos later on of the event, most of the people are not in green, right? There are probably like 3 other people that had out of 200 people. But in my mind, I'm going there with confirmation bias, and all I'm seeing is the green dresses, and I'm ignoring all the red and the black and the blue and everything else, right? So most of us are out in the world looking for the green dresses. And understanding that that's part of the mindset that you have as you're conducting whatever business you're conducting in the world is really important to know that you're giving short shrift to the information that's going to be combating whatever theory you're trying to prove. And so you actually need to pay more attention probably to that than not. It's also important to know that their mental models are good and bad, right? So it's not that they're all bad and they need to be broken down. One of the ones that we found in my research for people in financial services who were in a client-facing role, one of the mental models that they held was educating customers is my responsibility. I believe educating customers is my responsibility. That is a great mental model for people that are in a client-facing role. Like that's exactly the mental model that you want people to have in that role. So now, of course, most financial customers don't really feel like they're getting the information they wanted, so you then have a breakdown of execution there. But that's a different, that's still a problem, but that's a different problem. But that's not a mindset problem. And so when you identify the good mindsets, what you then want to do is find the ways to reinforce those, right? So you want to try to mitigate the bad ones, but reinforce the good ones. So when you think about how does mindset kind of fit in more broadly to corporate culture, we talk a lot about corporate culture and words get tossed around and nobody really defines things, so I'm going to define it for you a little bit here, at least for us to use today. So I talk about there are 3 pillars of corporate culture, and culture is kind of your input and behavior is your output, right? So behavior is what you can actually observe. You can't really observe culture, you observe the output of culture, which is behavior. So there are 3 pillars of culture that are your inputs. One is your vision. So this is the broad mission statement that your organization has, the kind of grand principles that they lay out. It's the nice, pretty words that they put on the wall saying this is what we believe, this is what we intend to do, this is how we're planning to treat people, right? All these big, nice statements. Your strategy, your strategic planning, that all is part of your vision. The second pillar is structures. And this is everything from organizational design to your compensation plans, to the processes you have for doing anything kind of throughout the organization. These are hard, tangible processes, right? So these are structures. And then the third one is mindsets, which we just talked about. And the challenge here, in order to get the behavior you want, you actually have to have alignment across all 3 of these pillars. And so I'll give you an example of what misalignment looks like. So I was talking to a very senior HR person at a bank, and she was telling me that they are really making a push on being more customer-centric. And all the banks are talking about this now, right? We care about our customers, we care about you, we're going to be customer-focused. And she was very proud of this. And they put it in, they changed the words in their mission statement, so right up at the top, and they're very proud of that. And they changed their compensation structure so that they were going to start now evaluating people based on customer satisfaction scores and actually changing their compensation based on whether or not their customers were happy. She was very happy with that. And she said, but it's kind of not really working the way we thought it would. We're not seeing the results yet. And not even 5 minutes later in the same conversation, she said, I mean, does anybody really love their bank? It's kind of like going to the dentist. And I said, if you actually think that, if your mental model is that these people can't be pleased, I mean, it's not even going to the doctor, it's going to the dentist, right? I mean, at best, it's kind of like mildly unpleasant. At worst, it's excruciatingly painful. But if that's your mindset about how your customers feel about you, you're not even going to try to please them. So you can change the vision all you want, and you can change your structures and your comp. Everybody thinks, oh, everyone's just focused on comp. That's the only thing that drives them. Not true. If you think that you can't please them, you're not even trying. So it's not necessarily that you're even trying to screw over your customers, right? It's not this negative mental model of like, I'm going to just take them for every penny they've got. This is just kind of apathy of like, I'm just resigned to the fact I can't possibly please you, so I'm just not even going to try. And so I said, no wonder that you're not getting the results you wanted from these other two pillars, because you have this third pillar that's blocking the way, and so the behavior hasn't changed. So that's what non-alignment of the pillars looks like. And our, the management consultants, and I do a lot of consulting myself, so there's no ding on management consultants, but they tend to work on the things that are tangible and that are concrete and that you can show real progress on, right? So they'll say, look, we helped you change the words in your vision statement. And yes, we helped you change your structures, right? They focus on those first two pillars and they kind of ignore the third one. And so a lot of CEOs I talk to are saying, but gosh, we've had the consultants in here, we've had McKinsey in here for a year trying to change this and that, and why isn't anything changed? And it's because you're not focused on this third piece, this mindset piece. So there are 3 different kinds of mental models. And some of them can be more than one. They're not mutually exclusive. But there are kind of 3 levels of a mindset. So the first one is around success. And that is, what do I think I need to do or not do to succeed in this organization, right? So I think they want me to perform like this. They want me to make sure I don't do this. What do I need to do to further my career and perform well? The second one is about respect. So what do I need to do or not do in this organization to be respected among my peers, among my superiors, sometimes peers of other firms. And then the third one is about, and those two, by the way, can overlap, right? So something can earn you both success and respect, but they're not always overlapped. And then the third one is about the self. And so this is sort of your own skills and characteristics, just sort of like, what are the mental models about what I believe about myself? I believe that I'm a good public speaker. I don't know, that's for you to judge. Right? But these are the mental models that we hold. And understanding these different levels of the mental models is actually very important to help manage around them. They are very deeply held. And especially in the financial industry, but in most places. Again, because we don't do a lot to combat them, because we kind of ignore them. We're focused on those other pillars, so we're not really thinking about them that much. So they kind of just, go on unperturbed. So even in the face of external shocks like the financial crisis of 2008, you would think this is like a big, momentous thing that will change a lot of people's minds in the financial industry. Surprisingly, no, or perhaps not surprisingly, no. And they tend to be most deeply held. So success to respect to self, the ones about the self are the most deeply held, right? Because that's really about you and your self-image and who you think you are as a person, what you think your own skills are. Your mental models about how you succeed in an organization could be a little bit more fluid based on sort of what you're seeing in your environment. But who you believe you are, those are pretty deep. Those are pretty solid. So in my research, I was actually able to anchor back some data before the crisis, and so looking at mental models of financial professionals both before and after the crisis, and there was almost no change across 96 different factors. Almost no change in how they viewed themselves, in mental models about the industry. One of my favorite ones was, I often recognize relationships between seemingly unrelated events. Right? So I'm really good at seeing relationships between things that, right? They missed so many massive trends The whole idea that the housing market could go down, huge misses. But they still, in fact, this actually went up a little bit since before the crisis. So I'm good at seeing relationships between unrelated events. I'm completely ignoring this massive thing that happened in the world because this is a mental model about what I believe about myself. And that's a hard one to change. It's a hard one to shake. There was another one about I'm good at predicting the probabilities of various outcomes, and I'm rarely caught by surprise. Because when your self-identity is so vested in that's who you are, it's very hard to shake those. Now, it's important to say that all these can be shifted. It's not to say that if you have personal mental models are impossible to change, but they're just different strategies that you have to employ of how to shift them. So I'll give you a non-financial example. There was a utility company that was having some safety issues. They kept getting dinged with safety violations. And they had, their line workers are just, middle-aged, blue-collar workers, very strong, tight-knit community. And so they started, putting out messaging that we really need you focused on safety, and you got to wear the safety harnesses and put on the safety goggles and blah, blah, blah. And they actually started dinging people when there were safety violations. They started fining them for safety violations. And again, so they're working on those first two pillars, right? They worked on the vision part, they worked on the structures. Again, they're not seeing the change in behavior. And what they finally realized was that the mindset, and this was a mental model around respect, this wasn't success, because if they wanted success, they would have done what the company wanted. The mindset around respect was real men don't wear safety harnesses, right? So I'm not gonna be the guy that's gonna look like the boob is, gonna put on the safety harness when nobody else is wearing it, right? Or I'm gonna put on those dopey glasses, right? I'm not gonna be that guy. And so culturally, if you wanted to keep the respect of your peers, the last thing you were gonna do was put on that safety harness. And so when you're dealing with an issue like that, and it's something about respect, you actually it works a lot like high school with cliques. You remember the cliques in high school? So there are culture carriers within an organization, and it doesn't have to do necessarily with the hierarchy, the sort of official organizational structure within a firm. It has to do with the culture of the organization. And there's certain people, it may be somebody who's particularly charismatic or somebody who's been there the longest, but these are people that become culture carriers in the firm. And what you do in order to change one like this, the safety harness thing, is you gotta pick off one of those culture carriers, right? It's like going after the quarterback or the head cheerleader. You get them to wear the safety harness, then all of a sudden it's cool and everybody wants to do it. And I know it sounds a little silly, like an old John Hughes movie. Is that like too old a reference for you guys, John Hughes movies? Yeah, okay. But it actually works. It actually works, which is fascinating. So the challenge that we have in corporate America, and maybe in households too, but the challenge is that there's a lot of disconnect between executives and the culture of their organizations. And because there's a lot of disconnect, we get a lot of misdiagnosis when it comes to culture. So people don't actually understand what's going on. And it's not a huge surprise. If you're the CEO of a large corporation of 100,000 people, it's not unlikely that you wouldn't necessarily know what the culture feels like, for entry-level employees, right? But sometimes the degree of the disconnect is a surprise to the CEOs. And there's a lot of research, not just my own, but a lot of other research of people in this field who show that the perceived culture among kind of the C-suite or the top level of management is markedly different than what you find in middle management and kind of the more junior ranks, because they're not in it day to day. And oftentimes when you wind up in the C-suite, you start to get very insulated. People stop telling you the truth about things. That's one of the hardest things. That's why actually people hire consultants a lot of times, because it's very hard to get people that work for you to tell you about problems. Nobody likes to be the bearer of bad news, right? So the C-suite people also, unfortunately, get disconnected from themselves, and they start to lose track of their own mental models. And so they'll know, well, here are the nice words I put on the wall, and these are the values that I want our organization to espouse. I may not actually believe them myself, but I'm going to just try to fake it because this is what I think. I want to believe those things, but I don't yet. So there was a bank CEO who was on their earnings call. So the quarterly earnings call, sometimes the CEO will get on and talk about, this is how we did this quarter, this and that. And it's one of the few moments you'll get sort of a public, unscripted comments from CEOs. So it's one of my favorite grounds to find good material for my work here. So what this one guy said was, he was talking about the need to cross-sell products. So selling more than one product to a certain customer, and that's how banks make money, right? If I can sell you not just a car loan, but a mortgage, and give you a bank account, all those things, right? You become a more profitable customer for me. And what he said was, good banks know how to get more out of those customer relationships. He didn't say good banks know how to serve their customers better by selling them more products. It was very transactionally, like, what can you, customer, do for me, bank? As opposed to what can I, bank, do for you, my customer, right? It's a very different mindset. Now, of course, in their value statement that they put on the wall, it has all these nice words about our customers come first, we want to create these deep relationships with them, but what comes out of the CEO's mouth is, what can you do for me? And that kind of mindset, which I guarantee you he didn't even realize that he had, or certainly did not mean to express on this public phone call, it can lead people, when they absorb that from the CEO, they'll think, oh, well, I need to employ more high-pressure tactics to increase sales, or I need to start churning in accounts, which is basically charging people extra fees for things they don't really need, right? So you can inadvertently create a terrible wave of behavior through your organization by not realizing how your mindsets track up with what you're actually trying to espouse in your organization. And you see that everywhere. And there's a lot of this, like, I want to believe this, I actually say this, but I want to believe this. And the problem is, unless you're sort of a sociopath, which most of you are not, hopefully, it's very hard to fake it. It's very hard to fake a mental model, especially in times of stress. And if you're an executive at a large corporation, there are going to be periods of stress. And you give yourself away, whether it's something that's as explicit as this, or it's the eye roll, it's the audible sigh, it's the kind of dismissing of somebody that you sort of didn't really mean to be quite that dismissive of. We all betray ourselves. It's very hard to lie consistently over a long period of time like that. So it comes out. So we get this problem of misdiagnosis. So people don't really understand their cultures. And what happens when you misdiagnose your culture is that you get to these ineffective and sometimes even harmful policies because you're trying to solve the wrong problem, or you're not solving the whole problem. In financial services, basically the culture gets this caricature diagnosis of greed is good, right? It's Gordon Gekko from Wall Street, it's the vampire squid, it's Mr. Potter from It's a Wonderful Life. It's completely oversimplified as the only thing that drives anybody in financial services is money, and there are no other dynamics going on. And of course that's not the case. And unfortunately, because nobody's looking for any other information about what else is going on in this industry, all the solutions are geared towards how do we deal with the financial issue, and they completely ignore all these other things, which I would argue are actually as important, or in some cases I think more important. And it's why we're still getting the bad headlines, right? The financial crisis is 6 years ago now, and we're still kind of seeing this kind of drumbeat of bad headlines, precisely because we haven't actually dealt with some of these issues. So I'll just talk about two of them to kind of give you a bit of a flavor, and I think these are two of the most important ones. The first one is this idea of, it's very important for me to be recognized for my intelligence. Now, this is probably not unique to financial services. People want to be recognized for being smart, and there's nothing wrong with that. You're all very smart, that's why you're here. In financial services, smart winds up meaning that I have all the answers all the time. I'm completely bulletproof. Asking a question is like just near death. I might as well just commit ritual suicide right in front of my boss if I have to ask a question. Like, it is that bad, right? And so what happens is, and I'll note in other industries, right? They're, like in academia, for instance. Well, it's not academia. Being really smart, maybe you're the one that asks the really, really salient, penetrating question. In the tech world, a lot of times you're the one that has the killer idea. You don't actually have all the answers of how to implement it, but like you have the killer idea, and then other people figure out all the warts and the bugs and kind of move from there. Financial services, you have to have all the answers all the time, or otherwise you're nothing. And so what happens is, because that mental model is so pervasive, you either think that you have all the answers all the time, so you wind up creating these massive blind spots for yourself, right? You're like, well, I am brilliant, so why would I even bother to listen to anything else that anybody has to say, or why would I need to do any further risk analysis, right? Because I've got it all figured out, because I'm brilliant, because it's important to be smart, and I am smart, and so case closed. Or, you're not sure if you have all the answers, but the last thing you want to do is let anybody else know that you don't have all the answers. So you wind up not asking for help and not raising questions. And there is a refrain that I used to hear all the time when I was a young banker. I know it still exists because I've talked to executives about it, and it may be in other industries too. But it's this refrain of, don't bring me problems, bring me solutions. So in the best case, you've got people trying to think more proactively about issues and be problem solvers, and that's great, right? In the worst case, you wind up with this incident that happened at JP Morgan in 2012, which was called the London Whale. I don't know, are you guys familiar with that a little bit, or maybe not so much? Okay, so anyway, this one relatively young trader wound up taking these humongous bets, got himself into a whole world of trouble, got a couple other people involved, got into even more trouble, wound up costing the bank $6 billion with a B, $6 billion. And even for a bank, that's actually quite a lot of money. So when you look through the transcripts of this trader and one of the other guys he was dealing with, you can see them saying, oh, no, don't tell so-and-so, meaning one of their superiors, because we haven't figured out what we're going to do about this yet. They'd already lost $2 billion at this point, and they still don't know that this is the point where you need to tell somebody else that you have a problem, because they still think that mental model was so strong that we need to fix this ourselves. I can't tell anybody, I can't ask any questions. It was that strong, $2 billion down, and they still think they need to solve it themselves. They don't know they need to ask somebody else. And that's the one when I'm talking to bankers, that's the one that starts to get their attention. They're like, okay, wait, I don't want to lose $6 billion. How do I fix that one, right? And then they kind of start getting a little more engaged. But it's not, this is not an isolated culture to JP Morgan. It happened to be a very public example, but it is the same culture that I see that pervades the entire industry. You could, pop bank to bank and you see the exact same thing. And this is one, that's about a mental model that's about success, right? How do I succeed in this organization? I mean, people actually said one of the mental models was, my boss would judge me poorly if I had to ask for help, right? Like, what's a boss there for if not to help you, right? And to nurture you and help you grow? No. So it's about success, but it's also about respect, right? Because you want the respect of your peers. Because if you're not seen as the smartest guy or gal in the room, then you're going to be ostracized by the rest of the herd. And so when I talk to regulators about this dynamic, one of the things that regulators are really focused on is this notion of how do you create what they call effective challenge in a bank, in an organization, right? How do you get to the point where people are speaking up and they're asking questions and they're challenging ideas? And everybody thought, it was just they're worried about retribution, right? If you challenge your boss and your boss doesn't like being challenged, and then they're going to ding your compensation or kind of grade you poorly. And what I've said to them is that may be part of it, but a bigger part of it is the fact that they don't want to look stupid. Right? It's as simple as, I just don't want to look stupid, and so I'm just not going to raise my hand. There's not much downside to me keeping quiet, but there's a lot of downside to me raising my hand and possibly being wrong. So the blind spots, the other side of this one we talked about before, has the same issues. It's a little, I think you see it a little bit less from a day-to-day standpoint as concretely as you did in the financial crisis. I mean, just as starkly as you did in the financial crisis. There were, all the bank CEOs were lined up in front of a congressional hearing, and one of them was asked, well, how come you were taken so by surprise by the sort of housing market collapse? Like, it just seemed to catch you out of nowhere. Don't you have all these financial risk models and all these sophisticated analyses? How come nobody could have predicted this? And so one of the CEOs said, well, our risk model didn't incorporate that housing prices could go down. And one by one, all the CEOs said, yeah, no, ours didn't either, and no, ours didn't either, and no, ours didn't. So nobody, and the millions of people that work on Wall Street and do this financial analysis, nobody thought, hey, we recognize that this would be kind of a black swan outlier event, but nobody thought to say, should we model in some downside scenario that housing prices could go down? And the answer is a combination of these two, right? It was either, I'm so brilliant that I don't need to think about anything else than what I've already thought of, right? I have a huge blind spot. Or maybe I did think of it, but these guys are way smarter than I am, and the last thing I want to do is raise my hand and look stupid. So this is to me, this is one of the biggest issues that we have. And again, it's not that you can't change these, but it's about attacking them in the right way. And so what I talk about a lot with banks and bank executives is this idea of creating what I call the culture of inquiry. So you need to start making it okay. You need to change what it means to be smart in a bank, right? So it's no longer I have all the answers all the time. You can have great answers all the time, but you need to make it okay to ask questions, and even to ask a stupid question, or to not have the answer, and to sort of create a little bit more of a collaborative environment. And sometimes, culture can take a long time to change, but there can also be some really powerful moments. Having a CEO or a senior executive say, I don't know, or ask a question, or get challenged in a way that feels constructive can send really strong ripple effects through an organization very quickly. So I think, and as I've said that often to executives, I think this is probably, to me, one of the biggest issues you have if you're going to deal with all the risk that you've got in financial services. The second one I'll just talk about quickly is what I call toxic self-interest. And again, this is not just about money, right? There's a component of it that's sort of about financial reward. Sure, there's no denying that. And this is not just sort of your garden variety, I look after myself, I want to make sure that I'm fed and clothed and have a roof over my head, right? This isn't just about survival instinct. This is about I am completely inward focused. The only thing I'm thinking about is myself. I reject authority. The mental model actually is I disregard rules and conventions that restrict my freedom. And it correlates very closely to sometimes it's okay to break the law. So this isn't about money. This is just about me and my kind of rogue freedom, and I just don't want anybody, don't tread on me, right? This is all about me, and I need to do what I want to do, and I don't need any part of you bank or you regulator or whomever. And anything that even seems like it's encroaching on my freedom, I'm just going to reject. And so when I talk to the regulators and how do you think about this and how do you deal with this kind of this mindset, and in fact the compliance folks inside banks as well, how do you create what I call bounded freedom? So it's not that you're going to just give people free reign, right? Because obviously that hasn't been working, as we've seen. But can you kind of create a space where I'm going to let you run free in the backyard? I mean, the backyard's fenced in, so you can't actually get anywhere. But within this space, I'm going to give you some sense and semblance of autonomy, so you don't feel like you're in this constrained place all the time that you're trying to kind of bust out of and you're ignoring all the rules. When it's about somebody's free will, and that's what they feel like they're fighting for, they're going to fight in a very different way than when it's just about financial compensation. So again, understanding that's the piece of it. And another piece of this same kind of self-interest is, and again, you think who would actually respond yes to this on a survey, but you'd be surprised what people will respond to in research. I feel the need to prioritize my own interests ahead of those of the company. People actually say this. I need to prioritize my own interests ahead of those of the company. And we've seen examples of this where people are kind of basically taking advantage and capitalizing on private client information for their own gain. And the idea here is you can't fix that kind of behavior by just changing the compensation structure, right? If somebody is that inward focused and is completely rejecting authority, just extending out the time horizon of their compensation, so now, instead of getting paid for the next 2 years, you're going to get paid over the next 5 years, or lowering their bonus, just doing that is not going to address that problem. And so again, if you're misdiagnosing what's really happening, you're not going to devise solutions that are going to fix the problem. And so that's part of why we're seeing these problems kind of persist. And so this one, the way to address it is you've got to start bringing people out and start pushing a more external focus. And part of it's about clients and how you're dealing with clients and pushing people in that way. But it's also about kind of being a part of the community of your firm. A lot of times, corporations get siloed, large corporations get siloed. Again, this isn't just banks, this is auto companies and manufacturing companies. People get siloed and they're in their own little space, and they're kind of just don't feel like they're part of something larger, like they're a good corporate citizen. And so whether it's driving people into volunteer activities with the organization, being part of recruiting, sitting on committees, that kind of stuff, which again seems a little silly and frivolous, is actually quite important when you're trying to deal with a mental model like this. So they are definitely changeable. It's not always easy, but understanding what's happening with them is, as I said, the most important thing. So diagnosing them properly and not assuming that you know what's happening, and not assuming also that you know what your colleagues are thinking, right? Because you have your own set of mental models which are unique to you because those are the experiences that you've had, and your colleague may not actually share the same ones all the time. Being cognizant of your own as well is very important so that you're not creating too much bias in your own mind, or getting too far out ahead of yourself. I always tell people that one of the most important things is to over communicate, especially when you're dealing with issues of culture. Most people, when you talk to them about leadership, almost to a person, I was just doing a consulting project with a financial firm, and I said tell me what you think your leadership style is, and almost to a person, every person said, I lead by example. And I said, okay, well, that's great. Anything else? No, that's the most important thing. I lead by example. Okay, well, that's good. Leading by example is very important. You have to model the right behavior. The problem with only leading by example is that you're not telling people why you're doing what you're doing. And it leaves them this room to make assumptions about why you've done what you've done. And oftentimes people can assume the wrong things. They're going to draw the wrong conclusions from the actions they see that you're taking. So communicating, over-explaining when you're dealing with culture actually is a very important strategy for effective culture change. Culture is hard to measure. I have been trying to do it for quite a while now and trying to research it. It's difficult. It's a little squirrely, but it's important to track the results, even in a directional sense. So, okay, well, we're not at a kind of scientific level of research here, but we know roughly these two elements are getting better. We're seeing this one kind of feels like it's getting a little bit worse. We're not quite sure. And it's not static. Culture is a living, breathing organism. It's any corporate organization is made up of people, of human beings, and it's very much a product of what's happening inside those organizations, and it can change. You can see the winds shift more quickly than you might imagine. And then, when we talk about leadership, in terms of driving change in mindsets and culture in general, leadership is absolutely key. If the CEO and the sort of C-suite are not on board, you're not going to get the change that you want. But authenticity is so important. As I said before, often, you can see where executives get disconnected from their own mental models. And so they're out there at the town, they know that they're at the town hall on culture, so they're going to say the right thing there. But then, 2 weeks later on the earnings call or in this meeting or, at some other event, they say something that just completely undermines everything they said. And they actually wind up doing more harm to the culture efforts than if they'd never said anything in the first place. So being authentic and really kind of meaning it is incredibly important. So culture change is possible. Understanding your mental models is critically important. It's just you need to know what you're looking for and how to shift it the right way. So I'm going to stop there.